In a forested area in Lopburi province, an incident occurred. At that time, Lieutenant Pierce's unit had to travel into the forest for a reconnaissance mission, preparing for training with military students. However, due to not believing the warnings from the villagers, he ended up encountering a horrifying story, leading to a tragic event. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. This incident happened to Lieutenant Pierce while he was on duty in a forest. The event took place around 1970. During that time, Lieutenant Pierce was assigned the mission of training assault students in Lopburi province. This training course was conducted in the forest, and Lieutenant Pierce was responsible for overseeing the entire training process. The training involved groups of 40 military students being taken into the forest, where they had to use various survival skills to make their way out within a specified time frame. The duration of the training was approximately 2 days, and if the students couldn't exit the forest within that period, they would be immediately dismissed from the assault training program. Before the departure day, Lieutenant Pierce and 3 other instructors contacted the local villagers to inform them that they would be using the nearby forest for training. This forest was close to the villagers' agricultural land, which was public land allowed for farming. Lieutenant Pierce explained the training details to the villagers, mentioning that they couldn't specify the exact duration of the training, but that the course required students to survive and exit the forest within 48 hours. The villagers expressed their concerns and advised against conducting the training during that period. When Lieutenant Pierce asked why, since similar training had been done every year, the villagers explained that it was the end of the rainy season and the beginning of winter, a time when no one ventured into the forest. One villager, who had previously guided people into the forest, emphasized that during this transitional period, the forest was considered closed, and no one would lead them up the mountain. Hearing this, Lieutenant Pierce suggested that instead of having the students walk into the forest, they could be transported by helicopter and rappelled down to the designated spot. However, the villagers still disagreed and cautioned Lieutenant Pierce, saying, "Don't you consider the 40 lives you're leaving in the forest? Have you thought about what they might encounter?" This remark prompted Lieutenant Pierce and the accompanying instructors to agree to first survey the forest area designated for the training. They planned to have a helicopter drop Lieutenant Pierce and his team at the specified points, then attempt to walk down from the forest to ensure it could be done safely. If they could successfully navigate their way out, the villagers agreed, albeit reluctantly, to guide the instructors to bring the students. After reaching an understanding with the villagers, Lieutenant Pierce consulted with local soldiers in Lopburi to see if anyone had previously released students at the designated spots. One soldier mentioned that he had used this area for training 2 years prior and volunteered to guide them. On the day of departure, around 9 a.m., everyone gathered at the base of the mountain. The exploration team consisted of Lieutenant Pierce and 2 sergeants. They traveled by helicopter, which took about half an hour to reach the drop-off point. They arrived at their destination shortly after 9 a.m. and began surveying the first area to determine if it was suitable and safe for releasing the students. They spent the entire day exploring the surrounding area until around 5 p.m. to assess potential nighttime dangers, such as wildlife or other threats the villagers had warned about. They decided to stay overnight. As darkness fell around 6 p.m., Lieutenant Pierce noticed it was unusually dark, so dark that visibility was almost nil. The weather was both damp and cold, typical for the transition from the rainy season to winter. They built a fire and simulated the students' experience to see if it was survivable under these conditions. Lieutenant Pierce hung a hammock for himself, while the two sergeants set up separate tents. Around 8 p.m., they gathered to discuss their situation, agreeing that nothing seemed too concerning. They decided that the next day, they would separate and hike down the mountain via different paths, planning to meet again at the base. They continued their discussion until about 9 p.m. The atmosphere atop the mountain was eerily quiet. Suddenly, they heard a faint sound carried by the wind, resembling festival music. Lieutenant Pierce remarked to his senior, "Brother, Khao Chin La is quite far from the temple. If there was a temple fair, the sound shouldn't carry this far." One sergeant added, "From our survey, there's no village in this area. We chose this location specifically to avoid training near communities or villages to prevent students from seeking help from nearby residents." After hearing the strange sound, they decided to hike higher up the mountain to get a broader view. They walked about a kilometer further, reaching a hilltop. To their surprise, the sound had completely disappeared, leaving only their own heavy breathing. Additionally, if there was indeed a festival nearby, they should have seen lights or heard more sounds from this vantage point, but there was nothing. Sensing something was amiss, they agreed to return to their camp. As they descended through the unusually quiet forest, they could hear their own breathing, and the cold weather made the hair on their arms stand up like spikes. During the walk back, Lieutenant Pierce mentioned that they weren't counting their group members, but were instead glancing around to ensure everyone was present. Suddenly, Sergeant Guy broke the silence, saying, "Hey, are there 3 of us, or is there an extra?" Lieutenant Pierce quickly cautioned, "Don't talk like that in the forest." Another sergeant whispered to Lieutenant Pierce, "Sir, I feel like someone is following us." Lieutenant Pierce replied that he had also heard footsteps but wasn't sure if they were real or imagined. The sounds they heard resembled footsteps crunching on twigs behind them. When the group stopped walking, the sounds ceased as well. None of them considered supernatural explanations. They wondered if it might be an animal or something else, but dismissed the idea of it being a thief. They decided to continue walking quietly, each step filled with anticipation of whether the strange noise would reappear. As soon as they resumed walking, the mysterious footsteps resumed, sounding like someone barefoot stepping on twigs, distinctly different from their own footsteps since they all wore combat boots. Upon reaching their campsite, no one spoke, and they all went straight to rest. Around 2 a.m., Lieutenant Pierce awoke suddenly, hearing the same footsteps circling their camp. He cautiously peeked out from his hammock and saw about 20 figures moving around their campsite. Being superstitious, he suspected these figures were not human. Lieutenant Pierce lay still, noticing the figures closing in. The shadows cast by the campfire crept closer, and he finally decided to get up from his hammock. When he looked around, the figures had vanished. Shortly after, one of the sergeants emerged from his tent, admitting he had also heard the strange sounds since midnight. They agreed it was best not to try to sleep again, fearing they might be too frightened to rest. Instead, they decided to stay up and talk. At that moment, one of the sergeants shared that he had heard a noise like someone kicking the tent poles. They concluded it couldn't have been an animal since animals typically avoid areas with campfires. Hearing this, Lieutenant Pierce suggested they might have encountered what the villagers had warned them about. Then, Sergeant Guy defiantly said, "Why be scared? Whether it's a person or a ghost, let them come. I'll shoot them." The senior sergeant cautioned him, "Watch what you say. This isn't our home. This is the forest. Do you know what's in the forest?" And when we came here, I suggested walking up, but you chose the helicopter. Did you make any offerings or ask for permission to enter the forest?" Lieutenant Pierce then confessed he had forgotten to perform the forest entry ritual or bring offerings. They decided to go to a stream the next morning to catch fish for an offering, as asking the unit for supplies would compromise the training's realism. The following morning, they caught 6 to 7 fish from the stream and made an offering. However, Sergeant Guy remained skeptical, dismissing it as nonsense and urging everyone to hurry back. After the ritual, they quickly packed up and began their descent, splitting into 3 groups as planned. After a long descent, they reconvened at a mid-mountain point around 5 p.m. Lieutenant Pierce realized they wouldn't reach the base before nightfall and contacted the unit to request an additional day for the survey. The unit approved, emphasizing the need for a thorough exploration. Lieutenant Pierce extended the survey to 2 or 3 days to ensure the students' safety during future training exercises. As it approached 6 p.m., Lieutenant Pierce set up camp again, building a fire and hanging his hammock. He also took the time to perform a ritual, offering his respects to the spirits of the land. Around 2 a.m., after everyone had gone to sleep, they again heard footsteps like the night before. This time, the sound came from the direction they had descended during the day. Suddenly, a voice spoke. "Why did you come here? I didn't give you permission." Hearing this, Lieutenant Pierce shouted back, "Who come here, bro?" thinking it was one of the sergeants. But when he peeked out of his hammock, he saw the senior sergeant shaking his head and waving his hand, indicating he hadn't spoken. Lieutenant Pierce pondered for a while about whose voice it could have been but couldn't figure it out. He eventually concluded that he might have been hearing things and decided to lie back down and continue resting. After some time, Lieutenant Pierce was startled awake by a noise. When he got up to check, he saw that it was Sergeant Guy who was about to pee on a large tree. Lieutenant Pierce didn't know what kind of tree it was since he hadn't noticed it during the day. After Sergeant Guy finished peeing, he walked back to his tent to continue sleeping. However, about an hour later, Sergeant Guy abruptly woke up in his tent, causing it to collapse to the ground. Seeing this, Lieutenant Pierce asked what had happened. Sergeant Guy then recounted that he had dreamt of someone pointing a finger at him and asking, "How dare you pee on my tree? I have been protecting it for countless centuries, but you did this without any remorse. Now, I will take you. No matter which realm or life you are in, I will follow you." When Sergeant Guy told the story to Lieutenant Pierce, his tone was not of fear but of anger. Lieutenant Pierce had to step in and calm Sergeant Guy down, advising him to wash his face and cool off. Lieutenant Pierce asked Sergeant Guy where he had peed. When Lieutenant Pierce shone his flashlight on the spot Sergeant Guy indicated, he saw that it was a large santal tree. As Lieutenant Pierce walked over to inspect the area beneath the tree, he was immediately filled with dread upon seeing the ground littered with broken shrines and headless clay dolls. He surmised that the local villagers who came to this area to farm and fish had set up these shrines because it was a watershed. Realizing the situation, Lieutenant Pierce quickly led Sergeant Guy to make an apology. Initially, Sergeant Guy refused to apologize because he was still angry and didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. However, he ultimately complied as Lieutenant Pierce ordered him to follow the command. After that, the two of them went back to sleep. After some time had passed, while Lieutenant Pierce was asleep, the rope securing his hammock to the tree suddenly slipped, causing him to fall to the ground. He had tied the knot securely before sleeping, Meanwhile, the tents of 2 other sergeants appeared as if all 4 stakes had been pulled out. Lieutenant Pierce then saw Sergeant Guy draw his military knife and stab it into the ground, declaring, "I am a soldier of this land. No one is allowed to mess with my fellow soldiers." He didn't notice that the knife didn't penetrate the ground, even though the soil there wasn't hard. Sensing trouble, Lieutenant Pierce ordered Sergeant Guy to stop talking and rebuked him, saying, "Even if you don't believe, you shouldn't challenge the power of things unseen." After things calmed down, no one dared to fall back asleep. Lieutenant Pierce's group discussed the situation and decided that they would descend the mountain as quickly as possible the next day, believing they could no longer stay there. The following morning, everyone set out to leave the forest. However, due to the considerable distance, they only managed to reach the foothills by the end of the day. At that point, they decided not to radio for help from their unit, thinking that being at the edge of the forest meant they were safe enough. They set up camp and spent another night at the foothills. That evening, after they had finished setting up camp, everyone went to catch fish at a nearby water source. They used the fish they caught for dinner. While they were eating, Sergeant Guy mentioned that when he was scaling the fish, he heard them cry out in human-like voices, expressing pain. Startled, he threw the fish back into the water. Hearing this, Lieutenant Pierce thought that Sergeant Guy might be severely affected by the experiences. He suggested that Sergeant Guy should return first, and he would contact their unit for assistance. However, Sergeant Guy, with his pride and determination, firmly refused, insisting that he would stay until the exploration was completed. After finishing dinner and taking care of their personal tasks, they all went to sleep as usual. Around 10 p.m., an unusual silence fell over the area. There were no sounds of animals or insects at all. At around 2 a.m., Lieutenant Pierce woke up to change the guard shift, letting the previous watchman go to sleep in the tent. He noticed that the zipper of Sergeant Guy's tent was open and, upon inspection, found it empty. Lieutenant Pierce decided to inform the person who had just finished the watch, and together, they began searching for Sergeant Guy with their flashlights. However, the darkness was so intense that they couldn't see anything. They decided to call out Sergeant Guy's name. Normally, in the forest, voices would echo, but this time, the echo that came back was the voice of an elderly person saying, "He stay with me." The voice was very loud. Startled by this, Lieutenant Pierce and the other sergeant quickly radioed their unit for help. The unit responded that they would come immediately, as their current location wasn't far from the unit. However, what was surprising was that the unit asked Lieutenant Pierce if they hadn't yet met the people sent to follow them into the forest. This puzzled Lieutenant Pierce, who asked, "Why did you send them?" The unit explained that when they were dropping Lieutenant Pierce's group off via helicopter, someone saw Sergeant Guy without a head, while Lieutenant Pierce and the other sergeant appeared normal. Lieutenant Pierce then informed the unit that, as of now, he hadn't seen any additional people sent by the unit. After that, Lieutenant Pierce and the other sergeant returned to the campsite and lit an additional campfire. They also left a note instructing Sergeant Guy, if he returned, to wait there. While searching for Sergeant Guy, they followed tracks that led them to the water source where they had previously fished. They saw footprints leading into the water. The other sergeant suggested they might be boot prints rather than combat boots. Lieutenant Pierce explained that combat boot prints and regular boot prints look quite similar. They debated whether to investigate further, but due to the darkness, decided to return to the campsite and wait for reinforcements. Upon returning to the campsite and waiting for a short while, Lieutenant Pierce saw a group of about 7 to 8 people walking through the edge of the forest. They assumed this group was the reinforcements sent to assist them and signaled and shouted to get their attention. However, the group walked past them as if they didn't hear anything. Lieutenant Pierce fired his gun into the air, but the group continued walking, seemingly unaffected by the gunshot. At that moment, Lieutenant Pierce doubted whether the group was actually reinforcements. Due to the darkness, he could only see their flashlights. He reasoned that it couldn't be local villagers, as no one would be walking through the forest at that hour. The strange occurrences didn't end there. Suddenly, their radio lost all signal, even though it had been working fine earlier when they contacted the unit. Lieutenant Pierce decided to stealthily follow the sound of the footsteps, leaving the other sergeant at the tent. However, the more he followed, the more distant the sounds seemed, even as he quickened his pace to nearly a run. Eventually, he found himself back at the fishing spot again. As Lieutenant Pierce walked towards the water source, he reached a steep path and looked back. He saw the silhouette of Sergeant Guy walking with an elderly man dressed in white, resembling a Brahmin. They both disappeared into a tree. This sight prompted Lieutenant Pierce to run to the tree, but he found nothing there. He then turned and continued towards the water source. When he arrived at the spot with the footprints, he was convinced they were combat boot prints. Then he saw something unexpected. A knife, resembling the one Sergeant Guy had earlier stuck into the ground, floating in the water. He picked it up and rushed back to the tent to fetch the other sergeant. Together, they returned to the water source, but the footprints were no longer there. Both of them decided to wait by the water until morning, as they were confident that Sergeant Guy must have walked into the water. However, searching in the water at night was deemed too dangerous. By around 6 in the morning, the first light of day illuminated the forest. While Lieutenant Pierce was washing his face, he noticed a military shirt floating in the water. This sight confirmed their suspicion that it belonged to the missing Sergeant Guy. Fortuitously, the group of people Lieutenant Pierce had seen the previous night returned, revealing themselves to be soldiers sent to search for Pierce's group. Lieutenant Pierce questioned them about their behavior the previous night, asking why they hadn't responded to calls or the gunshot. The soldiers explained that they hadn't heard anything at all, not even seeing the campfire as they passed by. They had climbed nearly halfway up the mountain, reaching the spot where Pierce's group had camped the night before, but saw no one there. Thus, they decided to head back down, which is when they encountered Lieutenant Pierce. At that moment, Lieutenant Pierce informed the other group of soldiers that he had found signs indicating Sergeant Guy had gone into the water. The rescue team began searching the water, but after 2 hours, they still hadn't found Sergeant Guy. Lieutenant Pierce decided to borrow a vehicle from the rescue team, which was parked at the trailhead, to drive to a village they had contacted before entering the forest. The village was about 7 kilometers away from the forest. He instructed the rescue team to stay by the water source while he headed to the village for additional help. When Lieutenant Pierce encountered a local hunter, he recounted the entire incident to him. The hunter then told Lieutenant Pierce that he had already warned them, but they didn't listen. He also added, "During the forest closure, there are many spirits and ghosts. Do you even know what you've done?" Lieutenant Pierce explained that they had been fishing at a certain water source. The hunter then said that the spirits in the forest might possess the animals and trees, and by catching fish or breaking branches, they might have unknowingly disturbed something. At that moment, Lieutenant Pierce asked the hunter to come with him by car and return to the forest. Upon reaching a point where the car couldn't go any further, they continued on foot to the water source. Before Lieutenant Pierce could do anything, a sergeant walked up to him and said, "It's too late." This statement left Lieutenant Pierce speechless. The hunter then told him to brace himself because what Lieutenant Pierce feared had likely already happened. When they arrived at the water source, they learned from the soldiers who had been diving that they found Sergeant Guy's body submerged in the water. The hunter then added, "I told you all. This is why I didn't want you to come here in the first place. I asked you to wait and not come for training during this time. Late November is the transition from the rainy to the cold season, which is when the forest is closed. Usually, training takes place in April, and there are no problems then." At that moment, all the soldiers present agreed to inform Sergeant Guy's family and requested a monk to perform a ritual to guide the spirit back. However, the hunter told everyone, "There's no need to perform the ritual here. He won't leave. Do you even know where he is? Even though he died in this water, we don't know where he was taken. We need to go to the source of this incident for the ritual to work." That morning's events led Lieutenant Pierce and his team to take the hunter, the monk, and others involved to the water source where they had previously fished. This location was about a kilometer away from the incident site. However, the hunter said it was unlikely to be the right place. So they had to hike further up the mountain, eventually reaching nightfall. This time, they had a larger group and set up a guard rotation after establishing camp. Late at night, the hunter suddenly woke everyone up, urging them to leave immediately, saying, "We can't sleep here. We shouldn't stay here." Everyone quickly evacuated the area as fast as they could. As they walked out, the hunter explained that he heard the sound of someone walking around the area where he was sleeping, which was the same thing Lieutenant Pierce had experienced. Lieutenant Pierce then explained to the hunter that their intention in entering the forest was solely for training and that they had no malicious intent. However, at that moment, the hunter simply replied that they needed to address the root cause. They continued to hike up the mountain until they reached the tree where Sergeant Guy had urinated. Upon reaching the tree, the hunter said, "This is it, the chanted tree, a sacred tree of our country. Didn't you know?" The hunter then set up the offerings and said, "If he did something that led to his death, please release his spirit and let it return home and not be trapped here." He then called Sergeant Guy's name and instructed him to follow the sacred thread. The monk then held the holy thread tied to the tree and slowly led the way down the mountain. By the time they reached the foot of the mountain, it was nighttime again. The hunter then said that they couldn't leave the forest yet. They needed to perform a ritual to open the forest and ask for forgiveness first, or else there might be consequences. Everyone reluctantly agreed to spend another night in the forest. In the middle of the night, a soldier suddenly sat up and shouted, "You will never leave as long as I don't open the way for you. I'll take you one by one." Upon hearing this, the monk began to preach, addressing whatever had possessed the soldier. When the preaching ended, the soldier sat down, crying and repeatedly apologizing, saying, "We didn't know. We're sorry." The monk then asked, "Now that he has apologized, can you let him go home? Please." Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew, and the previously overcast sky cleared, revealing the moon and stars. The monk then turned to everyone and said, "It's over now." With the situation resolved, the monk went back to sleep. By morning, everyone was able to leave the forest safely. The relatives of Sergeant Guy came to retrieve his body for the religious ceremonies. The hunter explained that the sounds Lieutenant Pierce's group heard initially were warnings that they shouldn't have been there. However, since they chose to carry out their duties, it led to the terrifying events they experienced.